Yeah, rock and
Yep.
roll.
Rock and roll.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Really wonderful to be here today. I'm Vicki Robin. Variety of claims to fame, one of which is that I'm hosting this wonderful panel. I was on the board of, like almost the founding board of Transition US, part of Transition Whidbey. We had one of the earliest transition groups on Whidbey Island where I live. I'm also co-author of a book called Your Money or Your Life, which is about transforming your relationship with money and achieving financial freedom at whatever level that is real for you. And I also wrote a book out of my experience with Transition Whidbey called Blessing the Hands That Feed Us, what eating closer to home can teach us about food, community, and our place on earth. And currently host of the podcast sponsored by Post-Carbon Institute called What Could Possibly Go Right? And I hope you'll all tune into that. So, so in this panel today, this is how it was billed. And then I have some thoughts on it. It was billed as speakers will be discussing some new economic and political answers that have been emerging to meet the needs and challenges of our time. What kinds of changes are possible in our current system? What new systems show potential for building a thriving economy based on nature and human rights? How do we actually divest from the fossil fuel economy? What is the seventh generation New Deal? These and other provocative questions will be discussed. And so, in my view, money is like the lingua franca in this world. It's like money. If it makes money, it makes sense. They say money talks. And across the world, it is the universal understood language now. In some way, because it is that, it has bleached out many other intelligences and ways to meet our needs. Alternatives to money as means of exchange and store of value are barely visible because the dominant money system shines so bright that it just eliminates from view the alternatives that actually, I think the people here and our speakers know are infinitely more satisfying and nourishing and actually secure. It's like money is what binds us to the economy. If we don't have a job, we don't have money. If we don't have money, we don't have food because we have lost the ability to meet our needs in any way other than money because we have been dumbed down to believe that money is the currency of power, dignity, respect, class recognition. And we here know that basically relationships are the foundation of security. Skills and talents are what bind us together, whether we're paid or unpaid, showing up and being of service to one another, meeting our obligations rather than just meeting our personal needs. This is all what makes a firm foundation for being able to be secure and being able to affect what you want to affect in your life. And power is the ability to do work. And does our economy do the work we need for regeneration? Will what we need to do to regenerate life on Earth actually earn money? And so I think this panel to me is so important because we're going to dive into these subjects. And I want to introduce all of our speakers today, and then I will invite them each to speak for 10 or so minutes and tell us what their basic ideas are, and then we'll have some conversation. So Lila June Johnston, Lila, would you a little wave? Yeah, is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Diné Navajo. Oh, Lila June, we did this before. Hanese, Cheyenne, and European lineages. Her dynamic multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. She blends studies in human ecology at Stanford, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. She is currently pursuing her doctoral degree, focusing on Indigenous food system revitalization. So Emily Kawano, Emily, there you are, thank you, is founder of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. She served on the RIPESS, the Intercontinental Social Solidarity Economy Network Board, for 8 years and co-directs Wellspring Cooperative. She has a PhD in economics from UMass Amherst, where she joined the Center for Popular Economics and served as director for 9 years. And Richard Heinberg, Richard, where are you? Is a senior fellow in residence at the Post-Carbon Institute and is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He is the author of 14 books, including seminal works on society's current energy and environmental and sustainability crisis. Richard has authored hundreds of essays and articles that appeared in such journals as Nature, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, The American Prospect, Public Policy Research, Quarterly Review, Literary Review, Yes, and The Sun, and on websites such as resilience.org, commondreams.org, alternate.org, projectcensored.com, and counterpunch.com. His monthly newsletter has been in publication since 1992, and he has been included in the Utne magazine's list of best alternative newsletters. So here we are, and I would like to start, I would like to go from the biggest picture to the most specific and practical picture, which means that we're going to start with Richard, and then we'll go to Lila June, and then Emily. So Richard, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Vicki. My two colleagues, Emily and Layla, are more practitioners who can offer practical advice based on experience. I'm merely a theoretician, but since I'm here, I'll try to offer something useful. The alternative to a regenerative economy or society is, of course, an extractive one. And that's what we want to get away from. But I think it's important that we understand it if we're going to be able to escape from it. I tell the story in my new book, Power, which is just released a few days ago, of how the extractive economy emerged. The story actually begins prior to the Holocene era or epoch in which we live now, when we all lived by what anthropologists call hunting and gathering. And these non-agricultural societies had ways of discouraging bullies from taking social power, sharing resources, and conserving nature. Then something like 7,000 years ago, as a result of population pressure within a certain area and increased frequency of warfare, a social innovation happened. And it involved a few things, all coalescing together. One was grain agriculture. This was an energy transition, going from the gathering energy from firewood and hunting and gathering to planting, harvesting, storing. And here was the key: grains could be stored and taxed. This enabled social complexity, full-time division of labor. So a whole constellation of social innovations occurred at the same time: metal weapons, writing, kings, full-time division of labor, including full-time specialists in violence, soldiers, money, and slavery. These were all slave societies. And they were very powerful in relation to other surrounding societies because they had the metal weapons and full-time specialists. So whereas previously humanity had experienced horizontal power, this was a new type of power, vertical social power. If power is the ability to do something, we speak of the power of flight, for example. Social power is the ability to get other people to do something. Horizontal social power is, well, we can all do this together. But vertical social power is a few people telling other people what to do using bribes or threats. And so vertical social power emerges roughly 7,000 years ago with this constellation of social innovations and spread from that point outward. And we've been trying to recover from it ever since. Another thing that happened with that constellation of new social innovations was the idea of ownership of land, privatization of natural resources. This idea had never really existed before. At first, it was just the king who owned all the land. But then later, as money and debt, which are really two sides of the same coin, money never exists without debt or vice versa. As these became more and more prominent features of society, the idea of personal land and resource ownership took hold. And the idea of investment of capital and returns on capital. And all of this evolves over thousands of years until we get to just a couple of hundred years ago with the emergence of fossil fuels. We would never have been able to extract and use fossil fuels without the idea of private ownership of natural resources and government support for investment and guarantees of returns on investment and so on. But once fossil fuels took hold, then the extractive economy, which was already existing and growing, took off in ways that no one could have forecast previously, because we could use fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are energy. It takes energy to do everything, anything at all. And with more energy, you can do more stuff. So we applied fossil fuels to the project of extracting resources at ever higher rates, transporting them further distances and faster, transforming them into products, and then those products become waste. So today, just through mining, mostly mining of gravel, sand, but lots of minerals and all kinds of other things, just through mining, we move more of Earth's crust than all natural processes put together: wind, rain, tides, glaciers, you name it. That's power. We have become the most powerful organisms on the planet. But of course, this is a perilous kind of power, because we've created a kind of doomsday machine in the form of the consumer economy. The consumer economy has to grow. How did that happen? Well, it happened largely as a result of a problem, which was the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened largely because of the problem of overproduction. With so much cheap energy, we could make stuff faster than people would normally buy that manufactured stuff. So with advertising, planned obsolescence, and consumer credit, we encouraged production and consumption. People became not citizens, but consumers. And the economy became a thing to be measured constantly by way of GDP, with its goal, bottom line, as growth. If it doesn't grow, it dies. And growth yields jobs, it yields tax revenues, returns for investors, profits for businesses. But you can't grow something forever on a finite planet. So here we are with the extractive economy taking over the world and imperiling future generations and other species. From all of this story I've just told you, we can get some idea of what it might mean to return to a regenerative economy. It's going to have to do a few different things. For one thing, we have to return to the commons as a way of organizing our relationship to the land, as opposed to private ownership of natural resources. A great American economist by the name of Henry George, all the way back in roughly 1890, was writing about this. We have to demonetize our lives to whatever extent we can. And the whole process that I've been describing is one of increasing monetization. Instead of sharing resources, work, labor, care, everything becomes increasingly monetized, thereby dehumanized, and also, it increases our vulnerability to everything from economic collapse to resource depletion and everything else. That means forgiving debt. It means experimenting with things like local currencies on our way back to a demonetized society. Horizontal power institutions, moving away from vertical power by way of normal employment, threats and bribes, to cooperatives, finding ways to work together voluntarily to achieve our goals. Obviously, we have to move away from fossil fuels, but that also means reducing our energy usage. Even if we found some miraculous new energy source that didn't spew carbon into the atmosphere, if we're using as much energy as we're using now, we're going to be doing enormous damage to the biosphere. So reducing energy cooperatively could be done by things like tradable energy quotas. We need to return to using renewable materials harvested at sustainable rates and reduce our usage of non-renewable materials. And where we do use them, try to recycle them as much as possible. Some can't be recycled so effectively. So we just need to, go in that direction. This is all of this that I'm just been describing for the last 3 or 4 minutes is very, very far from where we are now. All I'm hoping to do in this, 10 minutes is to describe a direction in which we need to go. And, we have another hour and a half plus in which to fill in some of the colors and outlines and shapes of that general direction. But hopefully this has been useful just as a, setting a tone. Over to you, Vicki.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to do some dialogue with you, but I think really we want to complete the painting before we start to discuss it, because you set up, I think that our next 2 speakers are really going to fill in some of the pieces that you've outlined that we need to be doing. So over to you, Lila June. What do you have to say?
Yeah, well, I actually want to, I think there's a really interesting question here. It said, if extractive economy emerged immediately upon the emergence of agriculture, does that imply regenerative economies require a return to hunting and gathering? And I think that also points to how I want to respond to Richard, actually. My answer to that question is no. And my second answer to that question is, indigenous peoples are often framed as hunter-gatherers. We were not. We were actually some of the world's first farmers. We have evidence of farming in Papua New Guinea in 10,000 years ago. The Aboriginal, there's this amazing book called The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aboriginal People Made Australia, and really talks about the cultivated ecosystems of Australia. And that is my PhD research subject, is pre-Columbian food systems here in what we now call the United States, and what things looked like here prior to Columbus. And I think the idea that I don't think it's agriculture that birthed power per se. I think it's more how people used agriculture that birthed power. And agriculture may have become a vehicle for people who were already in a position to want power in the first place. Because there were many, many, many indigenous societies that had incredible forms of agriculture long before anthropology wants to say we did. And we did not develop systems of hierarchy and power and control. And so it's really, truly about your intention within these systems. And one of the reasons why people like to think that agriculture started in Europe is because we live in a Eurocentric um, sort of scientific paradigm that sort of likes to conveniently ignore the immense amounts of cultivation that occurred with indigenous peoples. And the reason why the cultivation of indigenous peoples and the economies that were birthed from that cultivation were swept under the rug over the past few centuries is because if indigenous peoples had they weren't actually primitive, they weren't actually savages, and they actually had the ability to create these incredible complex food systems year after year and cultivate them even, then they actually had claim to land. And that flies in the face of the concept of terra nullius, which means no man's land, which was the conceptual tool that Europeans used to take indigenous lands. They're saying, well, there's nobody here. We're not stealing it from anyone. But when we start to talk about indigenous connection to food systems, indigenous connection to land, indigenous soil management, the ways in which every acre of the United States was actually under a controlled burn management system way before Columbus was born, then we have to admit that there were people here and that they did tend the land. And so soil management becomes a metaphor for belonging. But if they're just kind of sparsely populated, stupid Indians kind of running around eating hand to mouth, then we didn't really take anything from anyone. So I'd love to talk about the economies that sort of sprouted forth from those. And I can also talk a little bit about the 7th-generation New Deal, if that's kind of where you were thinking, Vicky, and how that relates to these. But what I've found within the economies that I guess emerged from indigenous food systems, I'll give you an example. The Heiltsuk of British Columbia, I talk about them often. They hand plant kelp gardens on the coastline, huge kelp forests with this certain species of kelp that grows very, very quickly. So they anchor these kelp to rocks, they anchor it to logs, etc. And they basically augment kelp habitat with their own hands. And because of that increased surface area of the kelp, it creates a place for the herring fish, a little silverfish, to lay its eggs, to lay its roe. Now, when they lay this roe every February, which is when the Heiltsuk New Year is, it all revolves around the herring. This litters the entire coastal ecosystem with eggs, AKA calories, AKA nutrition. And this creates a food base for the salmon, the killer whales, the wolves, on throughout the food web, all nestled within these eggs. And so in a way, these indigenous peoples single-handedly became a keystone species in this area. And it's really interesting how in this area, if the humans were to be removed from the system would collapse. And that's so interesting how we can actually touch the earth with in such a manner that not only are we not hurting her, we're actually helping her and we're enhancing her. Some people call this regenerative practice. We've been calling it many names for many millennia. Not just indigenous peoples here, but throughout the world. Ancient indigenous peoples in Australia, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Pacific Islands, and throughout the world. So what's interesting about this case study of the Heiltsuk is they really have an ethic of sharing. And you probably have heard of the potlatch communities who have these really vast ceremonies where they just give away tons of food and materials and things for their people. And the general understanding in these Pacific Northwest communities is that he or she who gives the most is the most esteemed. And so this ethic within not just indigenous communities, but this ethic of generosity, in fact, this expectation, this social pressure to be generous is sort of the opposite of what we see in what Richard was calling the extractive economies, where there's a social pressure to be selfish, not selfless. And so that generally what I've seen is that this ethic of selflessness does not come until collapse. And we really experience viscerally the danger of selfishness. Because as Indigenous peoples, and feel free to give me like a 1 minute mark or something, because I'm not track of time. Indigenous peoples have not always been so egalitarian. We haven't always been so advanced in terms of our food systems and our cultivation systems, and our equality systems. We experienced a lot of warfare, a lot of collapse, and it was through these very painful crucibles of social upheaval that we learned the hard way that, caste systems don't work, patriarchy doesn't work, self-centeredness as a social ethic doesn't work, seeing ourselves as above the earth doesn't work, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is my feeling that this great collapse that we're experiencing now, this global collapse, is going to be one of our greatest teachers. And on the other end of this very painful time that ourselves and our children are going to go through, we're going to never be able to say again that the invisible hand works. We're never going to be able to say that Adam Smith knows what the heck he's talking about. We're never, ever again going to be able to say with any straight face that Eurocentric Enlightenment era economic theory is the way to go. And that's what's been driving us. And so, yeah, I think just another, going to the 7 Generations New Deal. This is the Papua New Guinea article, 10,000 Years of Agriculture in Papua New Guinea. This is the sgnd.info. This is the second website I put there is the 7 Generations New Deal. And this was when I ran for office last year, which was this whole other story. Being a brown woman running for office not fun. But in any case, we developed this 7-point plan to address the climate crisis and also to address the inequity baked into the political system. So one of the key points there is to generate a task force to appropriately collect and imply Indigenous knowledge within government's systems. So, for instance, formally creating more dialogue between municipal governments, state governments, federal governments, and the local Indigenous nations. So it's really important to start doing this. New Zealand's way ahead of us on this. Canada's way ahead of us. Australia's way ahead of us. And when I speak to Canadians, they're like, we're more ahead of you. That's abysmal because we're not very far. But the US is so in the dark ages when it comes to having proper relationships with Indigenous peoples and healing those broken parts of our hearts and those broken parts of our land and our social systems. And so this was an attempt to sort of create a formal channel that Indigenous peoples could not in tribal governments, which are basically just puppets of American government techniques, but the true traditional knowledge could be an influence within American policy, and hopefully lead to a day when this country leadership is given back to Indigenous peoples. So I think that's some things that I think about as we talk about economy. But again, going back to my first point, which is, it's really about intention. It's about intention. How do we, agriculture doesn't have to be our dagger in our stomach. It's about how do you touch the earth? What is your intention? I talk to Hopi farmers. They say, grow enough corn to feed you and everything else. And they don't mind things coming to eat their corn. They grow the corn for everything. And I think that's one of the core ethics of Indigenous food systems through my research is this idea that we're here to feed everyone. Because economics and economy is really just another word for life. energy, food, being able to live. And money has become this stand-in for calories. It's become this agreement that this can be traded for those things, but ultimately it's about those things. It's about life. And so indigenous food systems embody a very sustainable economy through which we actually try to not position the human at the pinnacle of creation, and we actually turn it into a circle and say we are part of creation. And not only that, but these big brains were given to us by the creator to help us help our animal and plant relatives, that humans do have a purpose on this earth. They were not created by mistake. We are, yep. Oh, sorry, did someone say something?
I don't know, but actually that was an interesting little intervention because we're just about at time.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm happy to wrap up and pass it to Emily.
Yeah, so I'm going to just, I want to just pull out a couple of things that you said, because I found it really interesting. Number one, that it wasn't about agriculture, it was about ownership. You know, that it seems like ownership, like the enclosure of the commons is what they trace in the UK, you know, back to a sort of collapse of the basically the farmer, the peasant society. So I mean, that's a little clue in there. And then so that you're, you know, basically if everybody has to grow for their own little family and they're not thinking about growing for the collective, that's when you start to like induce selfishness in a system that basically, I think that humans are wired for generosity. It was just we're trained to be selfish. And the other thing I just want to pull out about sharing food is I remember years ago reading Jerry Mander's book, The 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television. And one of the things he pointed out was that there was always, when there was like a whale hunt, there was always sharing. Everybody came in and they took some of the food and there was feasting, and it was a bonding experience for the community because there was no refrigeration. And when refrigeration came in, that's to Richard's point, you know, when the power came in to separate, to like take and store, like storing money, but to store that food, people didn't, it started to collapse the cultural rituals. And then once they had electricity for the freezers, they had electricity for the television, so people didn't come out to the square. So it's just interesting to like note these, not just the sort of the basic thing about agriculture, but how that happened. And basically prior to the fossil fuel economy, there was a tendency to be a bonded community because that was the best unit for surviving in your place. Anyway, so that was just some thoughts on what she said, which was fascinating, and thank you. And now over to you, Emily. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, this is exciting. That was, both of those presentations were really interesting. I'm going to come at it a little bit differently. So I'm an economist by training, and I'm going to talk about economic systems. And I do agree, economy is about life. If you look at the root of the word, it means management of the household, which is like management of your little household or your community household or your national or your global household. I agree. But I disagree that economy is about money, but it's about so much more. And so I know a lot of it gets boiled down to like money, or it gets boiled down to like free trade. Sometimes is used synonymously with our economic system. And I think this is a mistake because capitalism is more than that. And we need to think multidimensionally. And just by way of explanation, so I, as mentioned in the bio that Vicky read, I spent altogether as a member and then as director of the Center for Popular Economics. I've been in the kind of popular economics field, helping people understand how the economy works, doesn't work, for, oh gosh, many decades. So I'm drawing a lot on that experience. So saying that, I am going to do a screen share. Hopefully this works. So I'm going to talk about solidarity economy. And sorry, let me just arrange my screen so I can see. Solidarity economy and system change. So as I'm sure we don't need to go into this, right? There are a bunch of converging crises that we're facing. So the pandemic, climate change, the racial justice uprisings, the creep towards fascism, not only in this country, but all around the world. There are many others I'm sure we could name. The interesting thing about crises is that they also provide an opportunity, very much like what Lila June referred to as like all these lessons, all these collapse, the state of collapse leads to lessons, and often there's a big shift or a big paradigm change. So this is an opportunity, like a once in a lifetime, once in a generation, once in maybe 2 generations, to really push for fundamental change, system change, fundamental paradigm shift. So when we talk about system change, I want to say we should be clear about what kind of system change we're talking about. So the 2 big buckets that I'm going to talk about is, first of all, just to name our dominant economic system is capitalism. Very clear, it's capitalism. Let's not mince words. Right? That's what's dominant. The other big bucket that I'm going to look at is post-capitalism. I'm mostly going to talk about solidarity economy. But there are different models of capitalism. So there's neoliberalism, which is what we see now, sort of cutthroat capitalism, race to the bottom, all that kind of free trade, laissez-faire, all that kind of stuff. Before neoliberalism, there was New Deal capitalism, you could call it, right? Where there was much more generous social welfare state. This came out of the Great Depression, right? Because that was such a disaster. There was a recognition that there was a role for government to play, both in stabilizing the economy as well as providing a safety net. And then there's social democracy. Think about Scandinavia. It's sort of like the New Deal capitalism on steroids, right? Even more so, much more government intervention, much more government ownership, as well as much more comprehensive and generous safety nets, social welfare. So just super quick about post-capitalism, mostly I'm going to talk about solidarity economy. I'm going to go into how we define that. I just want to point out here that what solidarity economy is not, is something that is post-capitalist, like authoritarian state socialism, for example. That would be post-capitalist or not capitalist. But solidarity economy would not embrace authoritarian models. So I wanted to define capitalism because pretty often people say capitalism, it's just so complicated, you can't possibly define it. So this is a definition that the Center for Popular Economics has been using for over 40 years and has pretty well stood the test of time. So number one, it's private ownership of the means of production. And so that very much has to do with enclosure and seizing land originally, but all kinds of enclosures. So private ownership of the means of production, the stuff that you need to produce, right? So those are the capitalists. The second thing is wage labor. So those are the workers. And right there, between the capitalists and the workers, you have class struggle, like inevitable. I'm sorry, my cat is troublesome. Yeah, so you have private ownership and you have workers, you have capitalists and you have workers, you have class struggle, inevitably, right? Even the kindest of capitalists, right? We're talking about the system. There's a tension here because the owners of the means of production are trying to maximize profits. It's very often on the backs of workers, right? Longer work days, cutting wages, poor working conditions, etc. So that's the class struggle. The fourth thing is commodity production, which just means you're producing for sale, not for use, which is why a lot of crap gets produced and a lot of things that we really need don't, because they're not so profitable. And lastly, there is market exchange, right? That's how goods and services are exchanged as a medium of the market. Okay. So that's a down and dirty definition of capitalism. Those 5 things, you need them all, right? So I have heard people say, oh, I work in a worker cooperative. We're capitalists because we produce things for sale and we exchange on the market. And I say, no, certainly economists would not consider a worker co-op a capitalist enterprise, because you do not have that separation of private ownership and wage labor, right? The workers own the business. Okay, so you don't have that class division. Okay. So why is this important? Well, a lack of clarity about what capitalism is can easily lead to just reforming and thereby strengthening capitalism. So for example, the New Deal coming out of the Great Depression, it saved capitalism. It was a time of great unrest, and people were looking to more radical system change. And by implementing New Deal, it kind of stilled a lot of that resistance and turmoil. Clarity about what your long-term vision is helps to ensure, like for a solidarity economy at least, that you're building transformative reforms, sometimes called non-reformist reforms, and not just strengthening capitalism. And an example of when we talk about Green New Deal, it has to, so if we really want to move beyond capitalism, you have to think about power, ownership, control issues, and not just from an environmental perspective. So I do want to say here that I'm not about throwing stones, but some people really, really believe that we can reform capitalism, make it, more caring, more just, more sustainable, and that's the way we should go. I just want to be clear, that's one position. I absolutely disagree. That's me personally. I threw my lot in with solidarity economy. Solidarity economy is very clear that we're talking about a post-capitalist vision. We do not believe, for many reasons, that capitalism will or can ever get us to that more just and sustainable and democratic world. So clarity is important. As Richard was talking, I just went and I got this graph. I just thought this might be interesting, right? So in terms, if you look at sort of takeoff of industrial capitalism, around about, 1700, 1800s. So this is just GDP, per capita growth. And so, there might be a lot of other things that happened, right? Agriculture and oil and technology, but almost universally, right? You really do need to look at what's the economic system is, the dominant economic system, because that really drives how agriculture is used, how enclosure is used, how colonialism is used to seize land, to seize people, right? So I just want to suggest that ignoring the economic system, it's just an important, a key important dimension. All right, I'm going to talk about solidarity economy now. And so this definition of the solidarity economy came out of both the US Solidarity Economy Network, as well as the global RIPES, which is the International Solidarity Economy Network, which engaged in a 2-year global consultation process. So this definition is that the solidarity economy is one, it's a framework. It's a theory, if you like. It's a very young theory. It connects practices and practitioners who are aligned with solidarity economy values. And this will look a little bit different in different places. But in the United States, US solidarity economy uses these 5. So solidarity, democracy in all dimensions, not just voting, but in your daily lives and work and community. Equity in all dimensions, race, class, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sustainability, and pluralism means it's not a one-size-fits-all model, right? We embrace that there are many different paths to achieving a more just and sustainable and democratic world, right? In the words of the Zapatistas, a world in which many worlds fit, right? And it is all about articulating a post-capitalist world. We're very clear about that. It's also a global movement. So I mentioned RIPES already, this international network of solidarity economy movements. The International Labor Organization runs an annual Solidarity Economy Academy. The United Nations has a task force on the solidarity economy. It's been enshrined in a couple of constitutions, Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are a bunch of countries that have national policy frameworks in support of solidarity economy. So there's a lot of there. Okay, just some examples. And I break this down into economic spheres. There's lots of ways you can break it out. But I just wanted to flash this. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but just to say in all these economic spheres, there are existing and successful examples of solidarity economy practices that align with those values. Things like worker co-ops, DIY, producing for yourself and your community, care work, waged and unwaged, in distribution and exchange, things like social currency, time banking, fair trades, swap meets, gifting with consumption, things like community land trusts, food co-ops, lots of you would know, electric co-ops, housing co-ops, finance, you might not know, credit unions by definition are a kind of a cooperative owned by their depositors. Pure lending, public banking, under governance, things like participatory budgeting. And here's one I want to pull out. And solidarity economy is a very big tent. So there might be some people that don't agree with this, but I think probably most people working in this sphere do. Certainly, I would embrace the public sector as part of the solidarity economy, right? Like, what is the state other than something that is meant to serve the public good, right? I totally understand that it has been hijacked by the, the elite or the 1%, but that doesn't mean that it is not, in theory, something that does serve the public good. Is not about maximizing profits, and it's a site that needs to be contested and struggled over.
Emily, you can just like speed it up a little bit because we're just about at time for you.
At time? Okay, yeah. I think this is the last one.
But don't stress. But I just
wanted
to give you a little signal.
This is the last one. So ways forward, I just want to make the point that from that previous slide, you can see that there is a lot that exists already. And actually, I won't talk about this one. I just would rather end with a metaphor of imaginal cells. So when a butterfly spins its chrysalis, its body starts to break down into this nutrient-rich goop. And these imaginal cells start to appear. And what's left of the immune system in this goop attacks the imaginal cells because it's so different. And it has a different vision of what it could be. Those cells are killed until they start finding each other. They start clumping and they survive. And then they start to specialize. Some become a wing, some become a leg, some become an eye, until it emerges as this completely different creature. A butterfly And so the way it relates to solidarity economy is right now we're kind of like these examples are imaginal cells. They don't recognize each other yet, right? They're not clumping yet. And part of what solidarity economy is about is trying to say there's a huge amount to build on. Many of these are ancient practices, some are new, some are mainstream, like the public sector, some of them are alternative. Huge foundation. We need to connect them and get them pulling in the same direction. Yeah, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, so we just have like about 10 minutes, and I'd love to have our speakers comment on one another, ask questions of one another. Yeah, so yeah, just do a little bit of a weave here. What are you hearing? Anybody, just pipe in.
Feel free to start if you want, Richard.
Yeah, I would just respond very briefly to something Lila said. I think if we had half an hour to sit down and compare notes, we'd see that we're actually very much on the same page with regard to pre-state societies and what they actually accomplished and so on. And I think one way of clarifying it would be discussing different modes of food production. So it's not just hunting and gathering here and agriculture there, and that's basically the only two options. Simple horticulture, complex horticultural societies existed before grain agriculture in states and still persist in some parts of the world. And I would argue those types of societies have generally been able to avoid a lot of the coercive social forms that grew up with state societies based on agriculture. Of course, is a word that comes from agere, the Latin word that means field. So we're talking about monocrops of fields of grain crops, and that's what was taxable. And that story, by the way, is told in this wonderful book, Against the Grain, by James C. Scott of Yale University. If you don't have the book, I'd recommend it as a really up to date survey of the archaeological, anthropological literature on that score. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, there's so much I want to say, and I could only imagine that our audience does too. So I feel very privileged to be able to speak here. I guess one thing I think about is my trip to Mexico. I've taken several, been very privileged again to be able to just go to Mexico and come back so easily. But one time I went to Puebla, this little town called Quetzalan, Puebla. Puebla is the state, Quetzalan is the little town. And they have this very wonderful collective whereby it all started, they say, by pooling, and I'm very curious your thoughts on this, Emily, pooling their money to buy sugar together, which, sugar is not the most sustainable or, like hip crop or whatever. But in any case, the principle of like, getting together, buying a whole bunch of sugar together and then divvying it up. And that began this, I think they have several thousand member economic collective that they all work together and there's no owners. And they have an incredible system going now. It's called Tosepan, and I'll put the link in here in a second. And it's all about essentially working together and joining hands and bringing our power together. And their system was far more advanced than anything I've ever seen in the US. And it made me think too about, these high-rise apartment buildings you see, and you just imagine some of these are each paying maybe $2,000 a month in the bigger cities for this little space. And if you have 20 floors and 10 rooms on each floor, that's 200 rooms total And if you times 200 rooms total by 2000, you know, you're looking at quite a bit of money that this group collectively, about, you know, 400,000 collectively, is putting into this system every month, about $400,000 a month. And that's just a 200 room high rise. I'm sure most of them actually have many, many more. So the collective purchasing power, which might be the wrong way to say that, but the collective economic power we have going to this landlord month after month. And if you times that 400,000 per month times 12, you know, you have $4.8 million a year that these folks are collectively giving to this landlord each year. And it makes me think, wow, what could this group do if they were united? What could this group do? And I think it's no coincidence that the powers that be do not want us to act collectively, because if we don't, this is a small example, but if not only could we probably all purchase a beautiful acreage somewhere and create some wonderful paradise together with $4.8 million a year, but also, you know, you think about how each and every one of us has our own car. That, you know, that helps the car industry. Each and every one of us has our own everything. Whereas if we work collectively, we reduce waste, we reduce spending, and et cetera, et cetera. So when I looked at Tosepan, they were the living, breathing example of this. And I just, again, think it's hilarious how communities of color are painted as like primitive or further, or like developing countries, you know, when clearly they're actually, perhaps because they're in this isolated space, they have the latitude to do these very sensible economic experiments that do not empower any one group, but rather empower all. So anyways, I'll stop there, but I really appreciate your slides, Emily, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your comments as well, Richard. Thank you so much.
Yeah, your example of Tosepan is the world around, right? That's how human beings have survived, right? Like collective, that's human history, right? Collectively doing things. And there are, you know, in my neck of the woods, we have a life insurance company called Mass Mutual, and it's a great big behemoth. But it started off people just getting together and pooling their money so that they could cover expenses when somebody dies. And now they're this great big corporation. And possibly, you know, they've lost some of that original collective accountability, but it is still structurally a mutual, which is very similar to a cooperative. There are so many examples, right, of people being able to do things together. And I just think it is no accident. It is absolutely no accident that we are encouraged and we're persuaded and we're convinced all to have our own little separate thing. I mean, it really is our economic system, right? Like that consumption, you know, it comes from the logic of our economic system of capitalism, right? Like a capitalist has to sell, right? You have to accumulate or die. It's called the law of accumulation. If you don't accumulate and you're not innovating and you're not maxing out production in whatever way you can, it's very likely you're just going to get out competed and die. And so how do you stay afloat? How do you accumulate, right? How do you maximize profits? One thing you have to do is you have to produce a demand. And right, you know, the whole marketing juggernaut, right, is all the time, constantly trying to convince us what we need, just us, ourselves, for me. You know, you all know that, right? This is not an accident. This is our system. It's systemic. Not just one bad apple corporation. It's the system that drives it. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I really encourage people to think about capitalism as a system. The system is the problem, not just individual greed. It's really the system that's the problem. There are surely greedy capitalists, yes, but it's really the system that's driving this kind of behavior.
Wow. Yeah, I'm going to jump in with a couple of thoughts myself from my own history. Number one, on capitalism, I used to say that the system, the economic system, works on breaking bonds, so that if you have a bonded community, then the community is like it's sort of mutuality, reciprocity machine. And so you only have to buy a few things from outside of that, need fulfillment, for joy, for food, for, teaching, for all the things, so the more disconnected you are from one another, the more you have to suck off the tit of the dominant economy. So I used to joke, it's like married couple, great, but divorce even better, because then you need 2 refrigerators and 2 washing machines and 2 stoves, etc. One of the people that I started Sustainable Seattle with used to tell this story of getting a school bus and taking a bunch of kids, on an outing. That's a little bit of contribution to the GDP, but have an accident, and have the children hurt, then you have the GDP goes up, so that we've been taught to worship the gross domestic product as though that is or the consumer price index. We're taught to worship the dominant measures of well-being, which are actually measures of what Richard's talking about, of degrading the capacity for human and natural systems to care for themselves, to do the self-healing and self-nourishing that natural systems are designed to do. That's basically the earth economy. Yeah, so I have a little bit of an intervention here saying, so if you had to pick like one thing that you see bubbling up in society right now that you would like energize, like this is a little bit of a lever, that is actually up and running and becoming visible, that if that grew, if that strengthened, if we added our energy to it, we would start to move this big tanker of capitalism and extractive economy in the direction of what we're talking about, because what we're talking about is a hugely heavy lift right now, because the dominant system, even though it's not meeting people's needs, it's the only thing they can see. So how are we going to lever this? Where do you see the leverage points as emergent projects, ideas, whatever? So whoever wants to jump in, I'd like to hear from all 3 of you.
Well, one of them is one that you just mentioned, Vicki, and that's GDP, getting beyond GDP. And as long as that's our measure of economic health and well-being, then there's only one solution, and that's more of the same. And that's what all of our political leaders are constantly pushing for. And that's the perversity of the system, because it appears to be a solution for the problem. We have too much economic inequality. So how do we solve the problem? Increase GDP. We have climate change. How do you solve the problem? Well, you increase GDP so we can pay for all these solar panels. But GDP going up doesn't actually solve any of these problems. Most of the problems actually are worsened by it: resource depletion, climate change, and on and on and on. So one intervention, it's only one of many possible and many that are going on, but just one I'll name is alternatives to GDP. Genuine progress indicator, gross national happiness are just 2. And there's actually a proposal in Congress right now by Representative Ilhan Omar to do just that. Of course, she's being ridiculed by it on the pages of Wall Street Journal, but I applaud her courage.
Right.
Yeah, I think so it really is about a lever for what, a lever for what, to what end. And because the first thing that came to my mind is if you could just honor Indigenous leadership within each place, that would change everything. for example, you probably all saw this UN report. The exact percentages escape me, but it's something like indigenous peoples, who are 5% of the world's population, are overseeing over 80% of the world's biodiversity right now. I believe those are the numbers. And they do this on 20% of the lands of the Earth's land base. So indigenous peoples are overseeing the vast majority of the world's biodiversity stockpile, if you will. Sounds maybe too capitalist in and of itself, but and so yeah, for me, I don't think I'm biased. I think even if I wasn't indigenous, I would be fighting for indigenous rights. But maybe because I'm indigenous, it's just so painfully clear to me that not only is it the morally and ethically correct thing to position indigenous peoples as the leaders of their own homelands, and to fall behind their leadership and be humble guests instead of entitled immigrants, but also it's a practical measure too, because these societies, by and large, have the paradigmatic good stuff, they have the practical stuff, they have a lot of the things we need to recreate these regenerative economies. Now, then the question comes up is like, okay, that's nice, Lila, but who on earth is, what can we do like today? Because the world just isn't gonna do that today. And so thinking more about, if the objective is for this lever to essentially change the minds of the people, to change the minds of those who have their hands on the reins of this world. Honestly, I wish I had some kind of hopeful answer, but I lie more in the category of building systems that work as a lever, rather than trying to tinker with and reform and inspire these broken systems, for two reasons. One, creating these alternative systems, it creates that safety net for when this whole thing does crash, and it's going to. There's just no way around it. So it's building that life raft. And number two, creating systems that work. I think Buckminster Fuller talked about this, is, creating systems that work allows people to realize, why aren't we doing that? It's kind of that classic, like, oh, the neighbors have that, why don't we? Like, so I think the lever for me is not to go. I almost went to Harvard Business School. I was this close. I had my Stanford degree with honors. There was no reason why I couldn't probably get into HBS. I worked in corporate America for a little bit to get ready, and my elders were like, Lila, no, that's not where the change is. The change is actually at home with your elders and your people and your language and building those systems. And they said, you guys control enough land to change the way the world thinks about food and water. And so really creating these pilot programs that work, to me, is the lever that inspires people the most. And what's beautiful about these small pilot projects is they don't have to be scaled yet. They just have to work, and they have to be visible to the world, and then they will scale themselves. And so that's sort of my thinking these days.
Thank you. Emily?
Oh, that's so interesting. I'd love to follow up with you about these pilot projects and learn more. That's great. Yeah, that's a lovely image about what was it? Indigenous people are stewarding 80% of the biodiversity.
Yeah, I'll pull up the article. Yeah,
that's great. That's really great to think about. And yeah, I absolutely support alternative indices as well. There are many, right? It might be more on gender, it might be more on the environment, this, that, or the other, happiness, but clearly something besides what we have. I guess my answer to that question is these are all pieces, right? So I actually would cheat and say my one thing is to recognize that we need system change. We need to fire on all cylinders. There's so much work to be done. We all need to be thinking like an ecosystem. we need to be thinking about our little niche, right? Like we all have our parts to play, and we shouldn't be trying to recruit everybody into doing what we're doing, right? There are many different parts to play, but it's partly about pulling in the same direction, right? So if you think back to the imaginal cells, right? Ultimately pulling towards, right? The reality is going to look different in different places, different cultures, different geographies, political, economic realities, etc. But still, the what we're all aiming for in terms of a more just, more sustainable, more democratic, diverse, cooperative world, right? There is a huge amount of unity in shooting for that, and we have such a foundation to build on. And just that realization is meaningful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Before we open up for questions, I just want to say my strategy on this has been relocalizing. You know, it's like make where you're planted bloom. And it's like all of the challenges of moving the system for me just exist on my tiny little island, you know, in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm working on what they call affordable housing, which, you know, is a misnomer. It sort of puts it all back into the economy and the GDP. And I'm working on food system transformation, you know, working on the policies that inhibit the ability of our producers to grow our food, which, of course, as the system collapses, Lila June says, as we experience more and more system collapse, especially living on an island, you know, we're going to have to feed ourselves. So it's being able to sort of look ahead to what's needed. And for me, my practice now is to use this where I live as my practice field, and my relationships as power, you know, as ability to do work here, and to build more relationships. And I'm also very interested in conversations across divides, because, you know, every broken relationship is a draining of power and a dependency on the dominant system. So I'm sure that many people here are doing exactly what I'm doing, you know, which is basically, you know, making themselves part of a place on earth, and then making the well-being of their place how they express their values into the world. And I just saw Jewel pop in, so that's probably our indicator that we're ready for the Q&A time. So Jewel's going to like pick out questions and from the chat, and then also I encourage you, if you have a question, to raise your hand. The little button on the bottom that says reactions, under that there have a little button that says raise hand. And I encourage you also, when you ask your questions, to ask a question, not use it as the opportunity to take the mic and do a lecture. Let's stay focused. Okay, Jewel, what do we got here?
Well, so far, Ron Duval is asking if they could speak to the connection between energy and money. Let me make sure that's that I have that right there, John. Yeah.
Yeah, I was addressing that to Emily, please.
Yeah.
Of all people, I probably have the least energy and money. I mean, obviously, you know, oil, right? If you're talking about oil and the money in there and the power and the, you know, the imperialism that goes on and all that kind of stuff. But it's not really I haven't thought deeply about that. I'm sorry. Sounds like a Richard question to me. Sorry.
Well, I'd be happy to say a few words. I mean, power is the ability to do something. We speak of the power of flight or whatever. Social power is the ability to get other people to do something. And money is a primary tool of social power. If you have lots of money, you can get other people to do all kinds of things, right? But it takes energy to do anything. So if there's suddenly lots of energy available, then there's opportunity for social power, theoretically horizontal social power, but in actual historical fact, vertical social power, to increase exponentially. And that's what we've seen over the last 200 years. We've had the amount of energy available per capita increased by 800% since 1820. And the number of capitas, the number of people, has also increased by 800%, from 1 billion to 8 billion. So this is just off the charts in terms of increase in available energy to one species, humanity. And it's during this very, very anomalous time in all of Earth history and all of human history that we've seen the growth of institutions, capital, investments, wealth, to the point where now 7 people control as much wealth as the poorer half of humanity. So there definitely is a connection between energy and money. If energy goes away, what happens to the value of money? That's a question in many people's minds. If we have less energy available in the future, either because we do something about climate change or because we run out of easily available fossil fuels, what happens to all the debt that's outstanding? That presumes that the economy is still going to be growing, so all that debt can be repaid. Those are just a few thoughts.
I just, as somebody who's written a book about money, I want to say that one of my attitudes, and I see this really in the networks around Your Money, Your Life and the financial independence community, is turning financial wealth into natural wealth. Whether it's permaculture and growing a garden that will feed you without many inputs, whether it's insulating your house, whether it's natural building. I mean, the permaculture community is a lot about building wealth that isn't basically material. It's working with the natural systems. So it's just one way, like, how are we going to reverse the flow of extricating ourselves from the natural systems and into the money system? And part of it is using your money to provide, whether it's buying shoes that are going to last you a lifetime. And so basically shoes are handled. You don't need money in order to cover your feet. So it's a set of principles that to think about. Anyway, so Jewel, next question.
Next question is from Jess Parfrey. What steps do we need to take to redefine, reimagine the social contract in this country? What are your views on a movement towards a constitutional convention to reorient the value proposition of this country beyond land ownership and towards collective well-being? Is it worth our time? It looks like it's directed to anybody.
A constitutional convention, is that the idea? To kind of to do a power to lean into a paradigm shift. Yeah, I don't know. Me personally, maybe it's just my cynicism. I can't imagine, right? Like, we can't even get equal rights amendment passed. Like, can you imagine a paradigm shift? I mean, this is big, really. It's big, whole system thing. Like, yeah, I don't know. Constitutional reform is like so difficult. It certainly wouldn't be my. I mean, I really think you need that grassroots organizing, and on all levels. I will say this as well. I do absolutely believe we need lots of pilots and lots of experimentation and lots of proof of concept. On the other hand, there are a lot of alternatives, anyway, like solidarity economy practices that have been around for hundreds of years, right? And before that, they were around for millennia, right? There's a reason why they're not dominant. Again, right, there is a system and they do not want these things to be strong. And I will say, if solidarity economy or some whatever word you want to use ever becomes strong enough, the boot will come down. I have no doubt about it, right? Like the boot will come down. And you can see this in isolated ways when African-American people started really building up all kinds of cooperative initiatives to support themselves, to own their own land. And there was a tremendous amount of stomp down, right? Ranging from violence to killing to just all kinds of legal ways of undermining those experiments. So all this stuff is great. Proof of concept is great. Education is great. And there's nothing that's going to take the place of just good old-fashioned organizing to be ready. Also, if we ever are successful enough to be able to stand our ground and resist that.
Thank you, Emily. And I think it's just in case folks were wondering why the boot has to come down if it's so great, it's that it, by definition, it shares power, and those who don't like to share power, that's where the boot comes from. But by definition, these are power sharing systems. And I think I don't want to sound redundant, but I think collapse is going to be really good for us in that regard. Is like for instance, it was only when California burned to the ground that people started looking to indigenous peoples to rekindle literally our indigenous fire burning practices. California was burned up and down for thousands of years by indigenous controlled burns. That was our fire ecology method. And it was done to not only create grassland savannas between the oak trees for all of the deer and the elk and the other types of herbivores. It is also done to regenerate the soil every year, bringing that nutrient dense ash, which increased the soil, the water filtration rates in the soil. So it recharged aquifers. Fire and water, fire and aquifers have this really beautiful connection to each other. And also we burned in order to prevent catastrophic fire. So yes, climate crisis has a really important part in why California is burning, but it's exacerbated by the fact that indigenous burning was prohibited in the 1800s. And so basically it wasn't until this catastrophe that European Americans were finally humble enough to say, oh, maybe we don't know what we're doing, you know. And when it comes to redefining social contracts from, you know, land ownership being the kind of what Richard was saying, like GDP being the definition of health, and land ownership being the definition of wealth, to collective well-being being the definition of wealth. You know, I think, at least speaking from my tribe's experience, it wasn't until Chaco Canyon collapsed that we got rid of our caste systems. And when Chaco Canyon collapsed, we say Creator sent us a drought as a gift to give us the courage to change, because apparently nothing else is giving us. I mean, we have like climate crisis warnings for 20 years, you know, and like nothing's giving us the courage to change. So these things are gifts in these sort of tragic but helpful ways. Anyways, I'm being a little redundant, but I'll go ahead and pass it off.
I just want to mention on the question of a constitutional convention to redo the Constitution, is that the people on the right are working assiduously in that direction. So we wouldn't have a guarantee that it would come out sweeter and lighter. So I think it's just, you know, I've learned over the last 5 or 6 years of like operating politically, which I haven't wanted to do, but I have, is that there's, you know, talking about power, analyzing the power dynamics in the system that you're trying to change, not just trying to exercise power from where you sit, that you think you have an idea that's better. I think it behooves us as a movement to be canny on that level. Okay, peace out. Jewel, what else do we have?
Next, another question here. Okay. Given the truth that the boot will come down, how can we best prepare our experiments to withstand the boot? And that's to anybody.
Well, since nobody else is talking, I'll just fill some space for a couple of minutes. Yeah, about the boot coming down. Yeah, that is, I mean, it is easy to anticipate that happening. I have a section in my book on power, on the social psychology of power, and a lot has been learned in the last decade about the social psychology of power through experiment and study. And as we all know, power, vertical social power, it acts like a drug, like methamphetamine or cocaine. It's addictive. Those who have power hate to see it challenged and lash out at anything that they feel challenges it. Also, having vertical social power tends to reduce one's feelings of empathy for others, and it also reduces one's competence as a human being, just your ability to think systemically and with foresight and so on. So people with lots of vertical power are really challenged human beings in a lot of ways, and I think we saw that with our former president. Not to be political about that, but so how do we anticipate that? Well, I think one thing is to make experiments support the communities in which they exist, and not to challenge power structures in necessarily. Sometimes it's necessary to challenge power structures head on, but there's a lot that we can do by going around them, solving problems without directly challenging. So that sounds a little weaselly. So I don't know, maybe somebody else has some better ideas.
Yeah, a little bit. I think for one, building actual concrete economic practices that align with the world that we want to see is a form of power, right? If you own the land, if you own the buildings, and it might be hopefully collective, maybe community-wide. Eventually, yeah, it would be lovely if we could do away with the idea of private ownership entirely, but we're so far away from that. At least collective ownership would be nice. But that gives you some, if you own the businesses, collectively own the businesses, that gives you standing. That gives you a voice at the table for any economic development table. That provides some power, right? And also that experience to continue to build and say, we could do it this way instead of the way that the mainstream economy is organized. So that's on the one hand, right? Like to us in Solidarity Economy, we talk about that as the build, actually building these concrete practices that align with our values. But the other piece is the resist, right? There's the organizing, there's the education work and bringing people along in the movement. And hopefully they're connected. So people who have an appreciation and engagement with these practices are also going to be more inclined to defend them when the boot does come down. And yeah, that organizing of people is, you can't beat that. I mean, you need that at the end of the day. You just need that.
Julie, I wonder if there's a couple of people who've raised their hands. I wonder if we could go to them as well.
Sure. There is one good question here. Maybe I can speak that first and then we can go to the hands. Somebody asked about the Brackeen versus, to Lila June, the Brackeen, I don't know if I'm saying this right, versus Heland case and what it means for Indigenous leadership.
Mm.
And I'll add to that question a little bit, just like maybe if there's something more, Lila, you could share with us around what is happening around the mechanism of giving, of transferring more leadership and empowerment to Indigenous peoples.
Right. Can you say your part again, Jewel? I'm sorry.
Well, the first part was in the chat, was somebody was asking about the Brackeen versus
Yeah. I saw that part. Yeah, but what did you say?
And mine was, I'm just curious about maybe some other things that are happening that are moving in the direction that you were also speaking about, and
Right.
ultimately having leadership, like some things that are actually happening, things that maybe we can support.
Right. So the Brackeen, I don't know how to pronounce it either, versus Holland, just that is regarding the Child Welfare Act. And it essentially was trying to declare the Indian Child Welfare Act unconstitutional. And essentially the Indian Child Welfare Act creates the conditions where Indigenous children can be taken from their homes and adopted out to mostly white families. And it is almost always a disaster. So it's sort of like the modern day boarding school. Back in the day, they would take our children, take them to boarding schools. And today it's sort of this adoption paradigm where if any Indigenous woman is not deemed fit by the state to be the parent, they can take that child. So I think that's wonderful that these things are being, I guess, intervened. And it's funny, Deb Haaland actually endorsed my opponent, my white male fossil fuel connected opponent, when I ran for office. So that was strange. I still don't, I kind of understand it. So, but I like that. I like that she is stepping up where she can, maybe where she's allowed to. It's a very, just even dipping my toe into politics, it is a gnarly place. So who knows what she's really allowed to do. But perhaps this is one place where she can fight for our people. I think it's a good step to sort of utilize her office. In case you don't know, Deb Haaland is the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior, which is a big deal for many reasons. So in any case, I have all kinds of thoughts about that, but I'll try to stick to your question. It's a good example of her using her office, using her position to start really challenging some of these things. She also did a little bit of opening investigations into the boarding school systems here in the US. So I'm grateful that she's doing these measures. I would really love to see her hit places that are, a little more risky to hit. That I don't know if she's going to be able to or even wants to, such as, the fossil fuel, the ways she could influence the fossil fuel industry with her office. I don't know if she's going to be able to, honestly, or the ways in which she could really focus on economic development that does not have to do with casinos, which I view as predatory, toxic economic systems. But in any case, to answer your question, sorry if I'm getting a little off topic, Jewel, what do I see that is getting us closer to basically bringing Indigenous peoples back to positions of leadership in this country? I think things as simple as the Washington Redskins revoking their racist derogatory logo is a huge win. And the only reason they did it was because FedEx threatened to pull their funding as a sponsor. Everything from every little win that we as Indigenous peoples have in this country is a win towards just being visible. Right now, we're just trying to be visible, honestly. We are the lowest on the ladder, below African Americans, below Asian Americans. We are in this imagined social hierarchy that the US is founded upon. We are at the bottom in our own homeland. So even just being known about especially with so many immigrants coming in from different countries. Very rarely are they taught about Indigenous history or how they are basically accidentally becoming complicit within a system of oppression of Indigenous peoples by moving here and participating in this economy and participating in the cities that are founded on stolen land, et cetera. So I think visibility is step one. I was thinking the other day, they had Black Panther, they had Shang-Chi, which is an amazing film, I thought, Marvel films, but I don't think it's any accident that there's yet to be an Indigenous Marvel movie, because we are just not on the radar, and like all the social justice things we're kind of like patiently waiting our turn to have this moment where our rights and our needs are met in this land, because the stakes are so high. If our needs were met, so much land would have to be returned. I don't necessarily think all of it, but like so much would have to be done. And just like narcissists have a hard time looking at their own mistakes, America is like a statewide example of someone with narcissistic personality disorder. They don't say sorry. They don't own up or take responsibility, and they think they're the best in the world. So we are really trying to get to that. But I think these little wins, such as the Washington Redskins, is actually a really big win for us towards just being known about. I think, sadly, Jewel, that's our step one, is like that we exist. So I'll stop talking. I know that's a lot to take in, and I know there's a lot of questions, so I'll go ahead and mute myself now.
Okay, that was awesome, Lila. Oh my gosh, so many more questions for me. But I'm gonna ask for the hand that's up. Andrew W., you've had your hand patiently up for a while.
Yeah, thank you, Jewel, and thank you to the presenters. This has been excellent. This has been addressed by the folks talking, but I really want to focus on this more because I think it's one of the most important things, perhaps the most important. It seems a lot of our focus, both collectively and especially individually, has been on waiting for or allowing for or hoping for larger forces to solve our problems and provide solutions, such as our governments, large corporations, the oil corporations, petroleum corporations, etc., the UN even. And I think our focus ought to be, for many reasons, just the opposite, locally, in place, where we're at, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, our communities, both for our mindset and for practical reasons. I think that's where all our power lies. And I think by acting is the best. It seems a lot of people are sitting around waiting for things to happen, but by acting is the best solution to despair and to get things done.
Andrew, do you have a question here, or is this just do you have a question for our panelists?
Yeah, thank you. What do the panelists think about keeping our focus locally and just that? Thank you.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go. Okay. So I agree. And again, it's firing on all cylinders. So solidarity economy certainly is really about saying there's a lot that we can do, right? We don't have to wait for the state. We don't have to wait, right? There's lots of things that we can build, right? In a way that aligns with our values. So that's part of it. In the long run, though, to ignore the power of the state is, in my opinion, yeah, it's not realistic, right? There's so much power in policies and that funding, and there's just so much leverage there that we also do have to be thinking about electoral politics and policies and maybe constitutional change. So when we talk about resist and build, to build a solidarity economy, we can move ahead and build on a local level. Oh, I want to say something about local. A lot of bad things happen on the local level too. And think about the fragmentation of our country, right? And if you just empower all local, local tendencies just to thrive, just because they're local. We will have a lot of also neo-Nazi and white supremacist nationalist blossoming, and we see that, right? I mean, think of the Civil War being rebranded as states' rights. So I'm all for local, but also it's a balance, right? Like I do hear in my circles some kind of essentializing about local, and everything that's local is good by just definition of being local. And I really think that's a dangerous path. Anyway, so thinking on all levels, right? Yes, there's a lot we can do right now on our own. In the long run, we are going to have to engage with the levers, especially of the state, and combat those big powers, right? The huge corporations and that 1%, that elite plutocracy.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Emily, and I think we're approaching a uniquely unstable moment in U.S. political life, and I think we all feel it, that the things are coming apart at the seams. What that means in terms of strategic action, I think is totally up for discussion. I don't think anybody really has a handle on it, because this is kind of an unprecedented moment. It's entirely possible that 5 or 10 years from now, we won't have one country, we'll have 2 or 3 or 4. It's that extreme. So those who want to get into the fray at the national level and fight the good fight, I certainly wouldn't try to discourage them from that. But if, for example, if you want to do something with regard to climate action, how much can be accomplished in Washington right now with political gridlock and so on, versus what can be accomplished, at least in some places, California, some other states and municipalities and so on. Well, all the really imaginative stuff is happening at the local level. Now you could turn the tables on that and say, yes, but unless and until we do something at the national level, all of that's just, can only go so far. And that's true. But, the whole calculus of local versus national, I think, is just being shaken up right now, particularly in this country. I mean, if we're having this conversation in New Zealand or Denmark, it would be an entirely different conversation. But for the United States, it's a moment of great instability.
I just want to pop in here and ask, if there's anybody here from not the United States, would you raise your hand? And yeah, there we go. And just comment on what was just said. Is our experience here in the United States distorted because of our current politics? Or what do we need to see here that you can see from the outside that we can't see from the inside? So can I just call on Francesca? You have to unmute yourself, Francesca.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it kind of links in with my question that I had before. You have the local and the national level, and the indigenous knowledge was always in place in a smaller kind of society. And where do we take that knowledge when we go into with the world population that we have? That's one question. And so how do you get that indigenous knowledge integrated into the system? And New Zealand is trialing that by giving back land to the Māori, by having more people, trying to get more people into Parliament, by having places for them to study, grants, and doing what they can. But you still get, I feel, a polarization of the Māori against the Pākehā, and the Pākehā are made up of a multicultural group. And so some people are saying that the People's Assembly should be 50% Māori and 50% Pākehā, but then you get the problem that the Pākehā is made up of 10 or 20 different groups as well, and you get a new polarization of that multiculturalism is not acknowledged, and the world has moved into that. So on one hand, I think we need to find a way of giving rights to the indigenous people, and on the other way, you want to balance it with the different world we've moved in, which is multicultural, which is much larger population, and which is yeah, what was my third thought? I don't know, but yeah. So how do we move forward? Because that is how I feel, you know, that it becomes difficult sometimes to say, well, we all have to move back to the total indigenous knowledge. That holistic view isn't totally that we don't understand it or that we've never had it. So I still feel it would be better to have a representative way of working together. Otherwise, you get a new polarization of us and them. What do you think about my thoughts on these matters? Is that question clear or not really?
I think it was. So are you saying what is an alternative to 50-50 essentially?
One thing, and secondly, should it be 50-50 or should it be an alternative? And secondly, how can we integrate the indigenous knowledge in a world which has such a bigger population where we have to produce so much more food? Because then it goes back to what Richard's is saying, that you might not be able to have a big United States. You might have to have local, smaller nations to be able to manage it if you want to have more democracy and a more people's assembly where they're working together, because that is time consuming and people always take a while to come to an agreement. And if you do this on a big level, how can we do that? So if you're going to look at the big vision of how, then that also I feel needs to be looked at. That's my question. Is that,
Gotcha.
do you see that?
Yeah, I understand. And I also see that Dawn's question has been reposted like 5 times. So maybe we should ask Dawn's question too. But in any case, I'll quickly answer because I know there's quite a few questions. So if I'm honest, I think it should not only yes be 50-50, but like 100-0 on the Maori side. Because think of it this way. Let's say a bunch of Americans came to New Zealand and basically asserted themselves as the bosses of New Zealand, and also took what land and housing they wanted. And then not only that, but also ended up denigrating people who were already there, no matter what, whether they were Maori or Pākehā or whichever. And then let's say 100 years later, we've kind of melded into New Zealand society. So it's kind of hard to tell who's really part of this new country or not. But that wouldn't change the fact that 100 years ago, people illegally asserted their will upon another people. So at the end of the day, you would imagine that those original New Zealanders would still need to have 100% of their place back. And so thinking of it that way, I think Maori at the end of the day should actually have 100% control over that entire island system. And that might be crazy. I don't think it is, but I can see how other people would think maybe it was. But in any case, I think from a moral position, I think that is the correct answer. I think Pākehā could be welcomed as guests on Maori terms. And then I would like to go to your other question. I also want to acknowledge that we only have 8 minutes left. And I know that JT has his hand raised and Don's question might want to get answered too. So maybe we could save your second part of your question for another panel.
Yeah, so JT, can you be brief, and then we'll go to Don's question, and maybe we can consider Don's question the wrap-up question so that everybody has a little comment on it, and then we wrap.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. So I am actually a co-owner of a worker cooperative that works on regenerative landscaping, and we also recently opened up a garden shop. So, you know, we talk about these things all the time, you know, especially how to scale from a small, you know, like local based worker cooperative doing what we can into a large scale, you know, cooperative network, hopefully with other organizations, with, you know, indigenous tribes. My question is like, any tips? You know, it's we're over here and we're, you know, struggling just to overcome the existing extractive system, and we totally understand it's really important to build from the ground up and start building these kind of like, you know, larger ecosystems of, you know, more restorative and regenerative practices. So yeah, any tips that you can give us, that would be very helpful.
I'm going to save that. Maybe there's this Mighty Networks that you can actually raise that question, because it's not just our speakers, but lots of people will have ideas on that. Oh, Emily, you want to say something?
So my day job is I help to develop co-ops. We're actually in the process of developing a landscaping co-op. So I'd love to just connect. I just messaged you. So let's just talk.
Great. And so can we get to Don's question before we do the final wrap up?
Yeah, Don is basically asking actually what our whole plenary tomorrow is going to be. So maybe this is something that each of the speakers can just speak to, but it's definitely a power-packed question about how you see people preparing psychologically, spiritually during this time of collapse.
Are you gonna, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I guess I think that one reaction is fear. And I think a lot of the really awful stuff that we're seeing, a lot of the striking out and lashing out and the intolerance and the hate is really driven out of fear. And so one way to prepare for all the scary things that are actually happening and coming together is just through our daily lives. And probably, you know, most people in this space don't need schooling on that. But I found, like, for example, in our solidarity economy forums, you know, it's just a vibe, and people comment on it. People come and they say, this is, you know, we try to give people a little experience of what a solidarity economy would feel like in a conference. But just that daily practice, try to be a little kinder, try to be a little bit more sharing, try to be a little bit more compassionate, etc. Just try to live it. It can go a long way, and it's something that anybody can do all the time.
Yeah, I think how we can help people prepare psychologically and spiritually is helping them reconnect to their indigenous prayer way. I'm actually half white, well, maybe like 45% European. And I was blessed to go back home to England, to Devon, England, and go to the sacred sites. And I think no matter who we are, even if our culture has been brutally ripped away from us by the boarding schools or by the Roman expansion or by almost all of us have experienced some kind of hit to our connection to our ancestral culture, our ancestral way of praying, or our ancestral way of knowing ourselves. I think each and every one of us, if we want, of course, is capable of praying those ways back to us. And I think, for example, you know, as Dene people, we pray every morning with cornmeal. And every morning we put white cornmeal on the ground and we make our offering and we say, you know, be with me today, Creator, be with me, ancestors, help me on this day. This is what I'm trying to do. And I think anyone, if they've lost their cultural practice, you know, to find something that is connected to your culture. Like I have a friend who is from Scotland and she's using mugwort now, you know, and like whatever it is, each of us are in a place where, you know, if you don't have any other way, you know, like to offer something in the morning, something from your people each morning to the earth, to sort of connect yourself, or even if it's once a week, however often we can, to embrace this time and to think about our ancestors who have gone through this before. You know, the Great Flood is in almost every creation story I've ever come across. The Mapuche in Chile have it. Dene people in New Mexico have it. You know, all around the world, we've experienced these big things. What would you say to those people then? What would you have them do then? what would you'd probably ask them to have faith, honestly. You'd probably ask them to trust. Even though it's hard to trust when like everything's burning down around you, it probably would ask them to trust that a new day will come, and that this is a part of our learning, apparently. And so, yeah, that's what I would say is, one, like, reconnect with your ancestral traditions, whatever those are. You can even pray them back if you don't have them. And also, like, what would you say to our relatives who, our ancestors in the past who have gone through these things? What would you say to someone who's been through World War I, been through the Great Depression? What would you tell them, and then tell that to yourself?
So thank you. Unless you have something to say, Richard, I'm going to.
Sure, I can say something really fast.
Okay,
I was in a collapse just a couple of years ago here in Santa Rosa, Sonoma County. We had wildfire. Everything was no electricity, smoke in the air. People evacuated from their houses. What I learned was you have to rely on your neighbors. And you learn in a catastrophe like that you want to be around people who are trustworthy, who are knowledgeable, who want to help. And people generally want to help in those kinds of situations. But if you're going to be around people like that, then you will then tend to attract those kinds of people if you have those attributes yourself. So learn to be a trustworthy person, a helpful person, a knowledgeable person, and you'll have the best shot.
I just want to say that I think everybody on this call is precisely that. And I want to give Dawn a chance to do the pitch for the surveys, et cetera, and wind us up. Thank you, Dawn.
Okay, just grabbing the link again. Yeah, please do give us your feedback. We're reading it and trying to make adjustments where they're needed to provide you with the best summit experience possible. We are just at about the halfway point. It's kind of hard to believe there's been so many wonderful sessions already, but lots more still to come. So definitely RSVP on the Regenerative Communities portal for upcoming events, and check out our Host Your Own calendar as well. There's some great events being posted there as well. And just want to thank Vicki for being the hostess with the mostest, and all our panelists for being fantastic. And hope that folks stay around for the next hour for our social garden for some more conversation. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.